Here I'd like to introduce one of the most popular sources for thinking about history in the context of history extension, and that is the German philosopher and historian Leopold von Ranke, who was very influential in shaping how many people think of what history actually is as a discipline and an approach to the past. So what we're trying to do is build some detail into our understanding of him in the context of the syllabus. Here I'm drawing from pages 12 and 13, trying to get a sense of who he is as a historian, how he actually saw the aims and purposes of history, and also how he tried to construct or suggest that we also construct our histories to make them good. Also, you might think about how this relates to some different debates that come up along the way about history. So, how history is perceived, okay, and also how history has changed over time as a result of different practices and different contributions of a range of people. So, in terms of beginning with this, let's have a look at von Ranke's biographical details. So, remember, this is just an introduction. This is not exhaustive. There's plenty of readings on von Ranke you can do that I'd suggest you would want to do to support this. This is just a general introduction. So he was a German academic, studied theology and the classics. So what that means is he was studying sort of philosophy of religion, essentially, and also the classics. So think of ancient Greek and Roman literature, essentially, that made up a large part of this. So he also worked in various institutions after graduating in Germany, including the University of Berlin, where he held a position for a very long time. So he was, in every sense, an academic, a professional academic who made a living out of contesting and creating ideas, essentially. He was also a dedicated Protestant, okay, and in Europe this is important because Europe was sharply divided between Catholic and Protestant in the period after the Reformation. Now that would be, tempting at this point to think that everything he wrote therefore had a Protestant bias, and to some degree it did, but it's not as overt as you might actually think. And in fact, this is one of the things that I'm going to suggest to you about von Ranke, is that it's easy to simplify von Ranke and make him out to seem more simplistic than he actually was. It's important to note that he was Protestant, but I'm not suggesting that that coloured everything he did. He also was appointed during this time. He was an academic, the royal historiographer to the Prussian king Frederick Wilhelm IV. So he wrote basically a history of the Hohenzollern dynasty, which Wilhelm belonged to. But again, this is an important point, because you would think that therefore if he's paid to do it, he would have written a history that was fairly glowing. Now, on most accounts, the history is fairly conservative in that it doesn't go out and critique the Hohenzollerns, but nor does it come out and necessarily claim that Prussia was a great power of Europe, or it doesn't necessarily overstate, the point is, it doesn't overstate Prussia's greatness just because of some nationalist bent that may have been underlying von Ranke's appointment. So that's an interesting point. In fact, von Ranke was criticized for not actually making the dynasty sound more important than it was. So although he's obviously highly connected to Prussian issues, that doesn't explain everything about von Ranke, and I think we need to be a bit more complex about him. A few more points that are important here, and that is that he wrote a lot of works on history, including his first book, History of the Latin and Teutonic Nations, in 1824, History of the Reformation in Germany. Here you can see his interest in those religious affairs as a Protestant, and again, he's not necessarily favoring the Protestants here in an overt manner. And he also wrote several volumes to a universal history, which is kind of like a world history. Perhaps read universal as world here for von Ranke. There were other volumes as well that were published from that after his death by some of his students got together and tried to kind of put together his notes. In terms of his context, there is a few major things that are going on here. Perhaps one of the most important is the fact that there were big debates, philosophical debates about history, time, truth and change and so on in his day. Now, these are probably around in every day, but von Ranke, I think, particularly was connected to these as an academic and particularly interested in specifically some of the big issues that were being debated in Germany. And remember, von Ranke is a contemporary of some pretty big philosophers, people like Hegel. So he, in a sense, is in a context. In fact, Hegel worked at the same university, I believe. So von Ranke is in a very intellectual context, and he is forced to really defend his ideas as someone who was defending the idea that history was important. So, in a sense, this is part of von Ranke's contribution. So it's important to understand some of the issues. One of the issues is the fundamental question of whether history was important. It had come under attack very much by a group called the Pyrrhonists, who were kind of a type of skeptic group, philosophical group, who argued that basically history was riddled with errors, it was riddled with the historian's interpretation, and it could never really claim to live up to this idea of factual accuracy or to represent the past. And actually, in many versions of the history that the Pyrrhonists were critiquing, there was a sort of very rhetorical history that was written in a kind of very entertaining and storytelling type manner. Von Ranke probably would have agreed with them on that many of the histories that were surrounding von Ranke were actually, in his view, not appropriate, defunct, methodologically, basically devoid of any good methodology. So that was a big debate, whether history was actually useful. Interesting that might mirror our own day with the challenge of postmodernism. There's also no agreement in this context on how to do history. And again, that might sound something that's common. We wouldn't say that there's one way of doing history in the modern world, but this was particularly pronounced in von Ranke's context, as we might think in our own, that there's very heated debates about how to do this. So there were big debates over those issues of narrative storytelling, how to use documents, whether you should use documents, what the role and imposition of the historian should be in all of these processes. So there was no kind of classic, if you might think of it like this, a classic model of history. In fact, it was a very, very diverse set of practices that were going on around von Ranke. I think it's also important to note that von Ranke came in on the back end of the Enlightenment, the European Enlightenment, where many people had been using, the philosophers in particular, had been using history basically for their own ideas. So they hadn't been going into historical documents and testing them to try and come to a conclusion. It was as though they'd already reached their own philosophical conclusions about human nature or time or the past, and they were basically cherry picking from the past anecdotes and stuff that could be used to kind of prove their point. So they already had, in the von Rankean critique, they'd already had this universal kind of idea, and they were trying to just see that in examples that they could pick up in history. And that's something that he is going to challenge. It's also important, I think, to point out that there are also not just obviously kind of types of histories that could be obviously critiqued by many historians today, but there were also emerging forms of very complex histories that are quite well respected, not wholly agreed upon, but well respected in terms of the fact that they were rigorous analytical texts. So, for example, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, written by Edward Gibbon just before von Ranke's time, this was this might look like a kind of a normal work of academic history that we would think of, rigorous use of a range of sources, a lot of analysis going on, trying to think of how the Roman Empire came to an end through considering a range of different possible causes rather than just explaining it in simple terms. This is a very rigorous kind of text. So there are developing models of what we might think of as modern historiography out there at this point in time. Also, there was an important group that were gaining quite a lot of influence and shaping the way people were thinking about the past, this group called the antiquarians. And basically the antiquarians were very interested in gathering artifacts and documents and testing them rigorously, partly just out of interest, not necessarily because they wanted to build a rigorous view of an entire sweep of humanity or a particular period of time, but because they wanted to verify whether objects were true and valuable sometimes. So these are often connected to the work of early museums and stuff like that. They were trying to gather artifacts and maybe test whether they were true or whether they were real artifacts or whether they were actually duplicates and stuff like that. That's one of the things that they were interested in. So they were very much interested in rigorously testing these things, these sources, for their authenticity. Were they real? And then also beyond that, actually trying to figure out sometimes what could be said on the basis of it, what those texts and those artifacts might have said about motive and bias and all these other sorts of things. And they were actually quite influential in developing some of the textual analysis that we tend to think of in terms of historical work. The important point here, I think the summary is that there's no unified or even dominant image of the historian in this context. Okay, so what historians do, how they work, it's kind of very fragmented around the place, different people arguing many different things. There's no schools of history in universities to organize how this should be done or anything like that. It's a very fragmented process. And this will be, I think, one of von Ranke's main contributions. In terms of von Ranke's aims and purposes then, what I think he's trying to challenge is a few things. He actually argues vehemently against the idea that you can use a unifying theory to explain history. So here he actually had a strong debate against groups like philosophers like Hegel. And Hegel saw a kind of a big world story in his philosophy that explained many aspects of life and thought and so on around him. Von Ranke argued that that was actually unhelpful. So he wanted to actually explain history not on the basis of a unifying theory, but on the basis of facts that could be established through artifacts and sources. So he's going at this in a very different way. Rather than, in a sense, history from a top-down view, von Ranke is trying to come from a bottom-up view. Let's establish some specific facts and then figure out what we can say on the basis of that, rather than saying, we already think this is true, how does that apply to this scenario? It's also connected to this is part of von Ranke's idea that he wants to argue that every period or nation is distinct. Okay, so he's arguing for a version of historicism to try and historicize events by placing them into their specific context and trying to understand them on those terms rather than our own, say, present terms. He saw trying to think of the world on the basis of present concerns as very dangerous, and ultimately it would corrupt our view. It's the opposite in a sense to his view of how a historian should try to be objective and not be so grounded in their current context that they can't actually think about how other people saw the world and what that meant for them. And that means, again, connected to this, he was arguing that history had to try and aim to judge the past on its own terms rather than on present terms. Okay, so he's a classic reconstructionist historian, that the past, a good history is an attempt to reconstruct the past. Okay, that's basically his argument. And in sum, I think it's important to see that he was trying to establish some sort of scientific grounding for the study of history, rather than you might think of it as a philosophical or speculative grounding. He was trying to argue for a scientific grounding, where you could gather empirical facts that could be tested and checked and agreed upon, and then the story could emerge as those facts came together and you put them together properly. That was his basic, I think, aim and purpose. A scientific model for history. So how does his history work then? What does it look like in practice? What do you have to do as a historian to construct this kind of history? Well, several core principles I think that are worth mentioning. One is that a historian had to be dedicated to objectivity. So they're not, they shouldn't be anyway in his view, particularly interested in the issues of their own day, but trying to understand the issues of past societies. So he recognized that this is quite difficult. He wasn't necessarily saying this would be easy, or you just have to gather some facts and then there's a story. He very openly says in a number of his books that this is actually quite complex, and he even doubts whether he's really truly achieved it in many cases. But he does think it's possible. And that's, I think, the difference between him and many other theorists on this, is that many people just accept or argue that it's not possible. And so their work takes on a different flavor, whereas von Ranke was striving to find this objective voice and this objective place to view the past from. Secondly, and probably again building on that, his approach therefore advocated a very analytical and cautious interrogation of the past. So absolutely no wildly polemical texts here, just basically using history to say anything you want. That was not acceptable. Opinionated history was not acceptable, so judging past people because you don't like them, that was not important. What needed to be established was to be fair to those people, even if you might actually personally think they were not necessarily, say, a king wasn't great. If you establish the facts that they'd done some good things, you have to actually say that they had done that. And also wildly speculative. You can't just go and imagine the past, according to von Ranke. You have to find the past in the sources. The past is locked up in the sources. Think of it like that. And the historian is trying to unlock the sources so the past emerges from there. It's not coming out of the historian's mind or imagination or speculation. It's coming out of the sources if it's done right. So there needs to be proof for everything beyond the historian's mind. So, therefore, sources play an absolutely critical role. Sources and evidence play an absolutely critical role in his construction of history. That is, particularly, he was concerned with primary sources. Okay, and he thought that they could reveal very specific factual information like dates and events. That's true. But he also was more interesting than that. And he did think that with a proper testing and analysis of sources, you could begin to look at and understand the thoughts and the feelings of people in past times if you contextualize them properly. So he thought that there was a way of really reaching back into the past and understanding how it actually functioned in a kind of essential way. It may not be entirely complete, but you could kind of grasp the past's essence. That was his argument. But you could only do that if you were reading sources critically and carefully, and that tended to encourage him, and he intended to encourage others, to do exhaustive archival work to make sure that they had the facts correct and that there was nothing missing, if they could. So part of the focus, however, in his construction is that he did often focus on major events. And what we're talking about here, think of that book, The History of the Reformation in Germany. Now, that's a huge event in German history, but who's to say that that's the most significant event? Now, this is where people begin to criticize, and we'll bring this up in a second, but he did focus on many of those major political and religious themes, and that kind of harks back to, say, the type of history that Thucydides was focusing on, the political and military history, focusing on wars, rulers, major institutions, and so on. So there seems to be limited room, not no room, but limited room in von Ranke's history for a type of history from below. Okay, so this is part of the problem for many people with von Ranke's history, is that it didn't really have a complete view of the past. But just in terms of understanding his construction of history, it is important to point out that he wasn't telling everyone to focus on major events and themes, but his philosophy of history tended to lead him to those things. And that's partly because most of the sources and the archives that he had access to reflected the thoughts and ideas of leaders and military leaders and political rulers and so on. So he was limited partly by the sources that he was claiming had to be used. So that's part of the problem. I've used this diagram in other places, and I think it's important, and it's basically just trying to represent how a few different schools of thought would consider history. So you've got the deconstructionist, reconstructionist, and constructionist schools. Deconstructionism is basically associated with postmodernism and would probably be considered the opposite to Reconstructionism. Now, I've suggested that von Ranke is basically advocating a type of Reconstructionism, which essentially, the diagram is supposed to be emphasizing the fact that the dominant role in creating history for a Reconstructionist should be the past and the evidence of the past. That's what really has to make up our history. The historian should play a marginal role. In fact, the historian essentially is just assembling and testing and checking the documents and assembling the facts in the correct kind of order and to be able to sort of essentially use them appropriately. But really, the dominant part of history is the past and evidence. And that's what von Ranke is advocating. So someone like E.H. Carr, who's a constructionist historian who says that history is a dialogue between the past and the present, is going to have serious problems with this and suggests that von Ranke's intentions were good, perhaps. And yes, there is a role for the past and evidence to play in our history, but someone like Carr is going to argue that your own personal biases and your personal concerns and present issues are going to factor into history more than von Ranke is allowing us to think at this point in time. Let's just pick on, there could be millions of quotes you could pick on, and often people talk about von Ranke in terms of that, trying to find history, the past as it actually was, is the classic quote. This is probably, I think, maybe a little bit of a different quote, but also I think it cuts to the heart of this in an equally important way. And von Ranke said that the strict presentation of facts, no matter how conditional and how unattractive they might be, is undoubtedly the supreme law of good historical practice. Okay, so this is the utmost principle, if you want to think about this in the von Rankean historical worldview, is that the supreme idea is that we have to strictly stick to the facts. Okay, doesn't matter if we don't like them, doesn't matter if they constrain our argument or our preferences. All we can say is what we actually come across and can verify. What he's meaning here, what it means here is that historians should only say what they can verify. But what they can verify in his view can include some interesting things like motives and so on, not just basic events. So he is arguing for a complex view of history, but he's arguing for some very strict boundaries on what we actually do. Secondly, I think it's also important to note that he's not suggesting that historians don't make arguments or interpret the past, but they do so only on the basis of what they can deem credible, okay, by using their sources. So they can't use theories, they can't speculate, they can't do anything like that according to von Ranke. If there's no sources, you have to not be, no dependable sources, you can't really say that something has taken place or that someone thought something without any verifiable evidence that that's what they thought. Okay, in terms of evaluating von Ranke, he's obviously one of the most important influences on history, I think mainly because he basically unified the dominant image of historical practice for many decades. So he's seen as the father of history for that reason. Although he drew inspiration from many different groups that were around him, he was very influential in a sense, synthesizing that into a dominant image of how we think of history. A historian, someone who interrogates sources, is committed to understanding the uniqueness of the past. They are responsible in citing material, so they're leaving a record so that other people can challenge them and that history can kind of build up a good sense, a collective interpretation of the past, and also that historians have to be objective. These were some of the core pillars of what he advocated. I think we need to be careful in suggesting that von Ranke was just simply naive, though, that he just thought you could collect facts and that some story would pop out of the page. He's far more complex than that. He understands the rigor involved, he understands the complexity, he understands that historians can get it wrong, but it's the ideal and what he thinks is possible that's important. Okay, so he understood the need for interpretation and that objectivity was difficult, but he thought it was still possible. So this has a huge, and maybe one of his most important influences, is that it has a huge impact on the way historians in the future are trained during his time, but also after his time. And in fact, during von Ranke's time, you see historical schools begin to develop in Germany and then in places like Britain and France and so on, and even over to America a bit later on. And that is that that's evidence of the fact that this professionalization of history is taking place around this dominant image. This is now groups of people working to verify information and develop dependable interpretations. Okay, so this is part of an important part of the process of the professionalization of history. Remember, before von Ranke's time, we said things were going on in all sorts of different ways. There was no real sort of general agreement about anything. There was no schools training historians. There were just people talking about the past in different ways. Well, now we actually have a kind of a unifying process that brings history, to some degree, it's kind of narrowing how history is seen. It should be about documents and analysis and so on. So he's therefore, part of that is he's therefore seen as the foundational figure in Reconstructionist history. And I think Reconstructionist history has to still see that it's not just built from von Ranke. Von Ranke was drawing inspiration from people way back as far as Thucydides and so on. But he had, I think, certainly an important role in bringing it into modernity, this idea that history could be founded in a kind of scientific, verifiable manner. It's also important to note that von Ranke has an important ongoing influence to future historiography. People like J.B. Berry, Geoffrey Elton, Keith Windschuttle in Australia and so on, they have all been critics of theoretical history and relativism, and certainly people like Windschuttle have been very rabid critics of postmodernism and anything that suggests that history is a kind of a relative construct. So this group is also, I think, an important group of historians who would argue against many forms of popular history. Histories that tend to be entertaining but not rigorous are going to be highly criticized by Reconstructionists because they haven't strictly stuck to the facts and been objective. They are going to argue that they are actually perhaps a dangerous thing for our view of the past. It's also important to note that this kind of Reconstructionist school does give a lot of weight to the professionally trained historian, whereas other more relative approaches to history might think that being a public and popular historian is not so bad. Okay, so that's an important part of this as well. The model, the von Rankean model, although many people agree on the principles of trying to interpret evidence fairly, the general model that he built, this idea that a historian could objectively arrive at some sort of conclusion, is widely seen as generally inadequate nowadays. For example, von Ranke, I think, is criticized for not being sensitive to many historical themes and events. Okay, so think of the history from below. He didn't really adequately include that into his analysis. He didn't include analysis of issues like gender, okay, or class. These didn't feature enough in his work, and therefore many people today would say that it's not wrong. They're not saying, many people aren't claiming that von Ranke was wrong, they're claiming that it was inadequate. That yes, we agree with the idea that historians have to try and be as fair as possible and use sources and be fair to those sources, but we also perhaps need to think about the world in even more complex ways than von Ranke. So it's important also, I think, to just ask this basic question that many people have asked of this whole approach of Reconstructionism, and this is far more complex than I'm suggesting here. But just importantly is this question: to what extent is this actually this objective of being objective as a historian, so being, removing yourself from the picture and being fair-minded all of the time, to what extent is that actually possible? And this is where Carr and other more relativist historians would argue that, history has to be some kind of dialogue, that there is always going to be elements of us as historians in our work, but there is also going to be elements of the past in the documents that we come across and the artifacts that we use. It's some kind of synthesis of the two. And so many people would just, again, argue, I think, that von Ranke is being a little bit too, perhaps, optimistic about what can be achieved here, and that we have to readjust, maybe relax the truth claims of what we're suggesting, and carry history forward in new and imaginative ways, depending on what society we live in and so on. So what I'm suggesting here is that this is one very particular way of thinking of history, von Ranke's way of thinking of history, and there are certainly others that many people argue for. To finish quickly, thinking about where this fits into history extension in terms of the debates you can have and that might come up in the exam, well, there's a lot of questions in history extension exams that I think actually help you think through this, and help you also, I think, see von Ranke as very relevant. So he can be used in a number of questions. Let's say you're asked a question focusing on the construction of history. How should history be put together? How important is methodology? How important is evidence? How important is objectivity? Well, you can use von Ranke to explore this idea of evidence, okay? That it must be at the center of historical analysis rather than sort of theory or some sort of personal interest or some universal theme. You could argue, you could bring that up and explore that idea. If you were asked about the aims and purposes of history, what are the aims and purposes of history? Should history be political? Should history be personal? Should history be popular? Should history be an attempt to make the past relevant? Well, von Ranke's usable here because he was actually arguing that history should just aim to reconstruct the past as it actually happened, rather than speculate, create, make it fancy, anything like that. He's suggesting that history has to be a very faithful discipline to the facts. The role of the historian. If you were asked, does the historian play, or to what extent the historian should play a role in his own or her own society? Well, there's big questions there. And I think von Ranke can be used to explore that, because he's arguing that historians have to be objective, well-trained, careful and analytical. Essentially, he argued colorless, which was for him a positive idea. And this is something that many other groups of historians and theorists actually argue against. People like the constructionists, they always accept that basically history is going to be positioned no matter what. So they argue for a different role of the historian, that a historian has to work in their own present day, but they have to try and reach into the past and make some synthesis out of it. So many constructionists tend to be a little bit more experimental with how they represent, what kinds of sources they use, what kinds of claims they make, right? So there's a debate between these groups here, and you can use von Ranke to open up some of these issues in a whole lot of ways. And remember, because history is often about sources, often about analysis, and often about questions of truth, then von Ranke is really hitting on a whole range of questions that I think you can imagine almost, not necessarily every exam, but a very high percentage of exam questions that come up in history extension, I think you could find Leopold von Ranke a very relevant source to use.